The argument that diversity is good for business or for organizations has been around for 2 decades now. This is what we call the business case for diversity. I was wondering if that would work for human service organizations. So a couple of years ago, I embarked on a very ambitious project with a few doctoral students to review all the research that was available on diversity in human service organizations and to find out whether diversity does relate to positive organizational outcomes. So we decided to do a meta-analysis. That's a statistical way of analyzing a large number of research studies. We reviewed 296 articles in peer-reviewed journals for 2 decades, the last 2 decades, in human service studies in human service organizations. We found 30 qualified studies that had the type of statistics we needed for inclusion in the meta-analysis. We had a national and international spread, both urban and rural samples, and a total sample of 413,372 participants together with all the studies. What we found pretty much substantiated the business case for diversity. We found that there was a positive connection between diversity and performance on the individual level in terms of job satisfaction, organizational commitment, at the group level with respect to innovation. We didn't have many studies at the group level or organizational level, but those that were available indicated a positive outcome. So we were very encouraged, and in a way it linked to other research and scholarly work that points to the positive connection between diversity and organizational outcome. So as an example, a colleague of mine, Scott Page from the University of Michigan, came up with this concept of super additivity. In other words, he says that with diversity, 1 + 1 = 3. How come? In an organization, when you have two employees with similar backgrounds, they bring similar ideas, and therefore 1 + 1 = 2. But if you bring two people from different backgrounds, then you have the ideas of the first one that come from his or her background, the ideas of the second one, and then the interaction between them. That's why it's super additivity, or 1 + 1 = 3. Related to that topic, and as a demonstration of why organizations would be interested in diversity with respect to fulfilling the mission, I'll tell you one more thing, and that is, a few years ago, I received a call from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, inviting me to give a keynote on diversity and inclusion in a global context. I was, of course, flattered, but a bit surprised. Why would the IMF be interested in diversity and inclusion? It turned out that the IMF, with all the brilliant macroeconomists that work there, failed to predict the financial crisis of 2008. And in an investigative report that the IMF created afterwards to look at the performance in the run-up to the crisis, among other things, they came up to the conclusion that there wasn't enough diversity of thought within the IMF. In other words, in order for someone to challenge a concept, you need people to come from different perspectives so that they can look at it and say, okay, all of you think this way, but I think something else. As a result of that report and some other things that happened in the IMF, the organization appointed for the first time in its history a woman to lead the organization, Christine Lagarde. And for the first time, she's not an economist, but an attorney and a politician. So with that, let's think of another example for the business case for diversity and why diversity is related to the bottom line. There was a really interesting study that looked at diversity as related to stock prices and changes in stock price. They examined 34 companies for 7 years. They looked at the timeline, and they looked at the stock price in response, the changes in response to positive diversity changes and negative diversity changes. The indicators for positive diversity changes were awards for high quality diversity programs, and the indicators for negative diversity practices were lawsuits against organizations as related to diversity. And indeed, they found that following awards related to diversity, stock prices went up. And following lawsuits related to diversity, stock prices went down. All of that indicates or substantiates the business case for diversity. However, and there's a big however here, several studies, if you look very closely, found that diversity has no difference or even negative impact on measured outcomes. And that's a bit startling if you subscribe to the business case. And here we introduce the diversity paradox. Diversity is related to competitive advantage because it improves innovation and creativity within an organization. But it is also related to lower competitive advantage because it might trigger intergroup tensions, conflicts, and distrust. And there's a really interesting study that looked at diversity in work teams as related to the effectiveness of those work teams. And this study found that work teams that were diverse were either highly effective or highly ineffective in their work. The non-diverse teams were somewhere in the happy middle. So first of all, if you want mediocrity, you can do without diversity. But if you want excellence, you certainly need diversity. But then we're puzzled. How come diversity can lead to less effective work of those teams, some of the teams? And this is where we begin to understand that actual productivity of diverse work teams is the sum of the potential productivity, which is high because of creativity, understanding different perspectives, originality, understanding different groups of clients or consumers. But the actual productivity is lowered due to negative relationships between potentially negative relationships within those teams that are related to mistrust, miscommunication, tension, lack of cohesion, and lack of agreement because people come from different backgrounds. And that's where I would like to introduce the idea that inclusion is really the key to understanding effective diversity management. So you have diverse teams or diverse groups. How do you manage them effectively? You need to make sure that you enhance inclusion within those organizations. My definition of inclusion in my book is that inclusion refers to individuals' sense of being a part of the organizational system in both the formal processes, such as access to information and decision-making channels, and also the informal processes, such as hall conversations and lunch meetings, what we call the water cooler conversations, where information and decisions take place informally. And so if you put all of this together, you can see that diversity within the organization could lead to either beneficial outcomes or detrimental outcomes. But if you put climate of inclusion into the mix, you can control the relationship and make sure that diversity does lead primarily to beneficial outcomes. And I want to conclude with explaining what climate for inclusion is. Organizational climate in general, it relates to shared employees' perceptions with relate to an aspect of the organizational life. And so climate for inclusion relates to shared employees' perceptions of the extent to which organizational policies encourage and reward acceptance of demographically diverse employees by recognizing their unique attributes, providing them with a sense of belonging, and encouraging their involvement in organizational communication and decision-making processes.